Hi everyone, welcome to our second session in the joint training between this year's PAUDC and next year's EUDC. My name is Martha. This workshop is going to be on chairing a debate, specifically a British parliamentary debate. So we're going to talk about a couple of things. Let me know, by the way, if the slide doesn't change because the setup's a bit weird here. But we're going to talk about a couple of things. The first is we're going to talk about the role of the chair and what is different between chairing a debate and paneling a debate. The second is to talk about panel management and how you might want to approach deliberation. The third is to talk about oral adjudications. And finally, at the end, we'll have time for questions. I will stop recording before the Q&A. So if you do have any questions, you're very welcome to ask them without being recorded forever. So, what is the role of the chair and what does the chair do that is different to what a panelist does in a BP debate? Broadly speaking, the chair is doing three things. We're going to focus on the second and third for the purpose of this workshop. The first is that the chair keeps order during the debate. So they facilitate the introductions. That's annoying. Okay, 1 second. Is that better? Okay, fingers crossed this works slightly better. The first thing the chair does that is different to what a panelist is going to do in a debate is to keep order during the debate. So that is things like facilitating the introductions at the start, shushing particularly loud participants during speeches if they're preventing the debate taking place properly, things like preventing barracking, etc. The second thing they will do is manage the discussion during the deliberation. And the third is explain the decision made to the teams in the oral adjudication if it is an open round. So we're going to focus on the second and third in that these are the most pressing issues and also the ones people tend to struggle with the most when transitioning from being a panelist to being a chair. Something I don't have on the slide, but that is also somewhat important, is that the chair is also the sole point of contact between the CA team of a competition and the other judges on the panel. And what that means is that when it comes to things like judge feedback, the chair has also been entrusted with quite a lot of responsibility in that department. And that responsibility extends also to making sure that there is fair and accurate feedback on the panelists, but also not just in representing the panelists, the CAs in the feedback given there, also making sure that what the teams get from the account the teams get as a deliberation is also accurate. So the oral adjudication is also something that reflects the discussions that took place in deliberation, even if the other panelists are not also able to verbally express their reasoning for their call. A good chair is probably broadly four things. The first is confident in the sense that you have to manage a panel of possibly 3 to 5 different judges to make sure that within 15 minutes you're able to come to a consensus or at least majority call and then deliver a set of reasoning as to how that call was reached that's able to reflect that discussion. You should be able to, keep time and manage the debate as it goes on. And confidence helps with that. You should know you have been trusted in the position you're in. You've been put in that position because you've done well in other senses. You've been rewarded that way by the CA team. So there is a level to which you should just have a bit of confidence and trust that you're going to make the right decisions in that respect. The second is that a good chair is deliberate. So when we are talking about managing a panel or talking about giving an oral adjudication, there should never be a sort of you should never start a sentence without really knowing where it's going to end. And you should never start a deliberation or oral adjudication without some idea of where you're going to go during it. What that means then is that when you are doing things like deciding which comparisons to discuss during a deliberation or which order to do your oral adjudication, you should be quite deliberate about the way you are doing so, and you should be making choices that make some kind of logical sense as to why you're doing them in that order. The third thing is that a good chair should be thorough, which means that in assessing a pairwise comparison and in assessing in the oral adjudication why one team has defeated another, you should be detailed in your reasoning and make sure that you are actually covering all the relevant material as to why one team loses to another or what each team has brought to the debate. And finally, a good chair should be open to being persuaded. Ultimately, debating is in some level a subjective game. It is also a game of persuasion as well as being an analytical game. And any judge, even if they're chairing a debate, might miss something sometimes. They might misunderstand an argument or miss a certain response or incorrectly believe something was proven when it might not have been proven. And it is very possible that your panelists might explain where you are wrong or convince you that you have misread the debate in a certain sense. So chairs who are unwilling to be persuaded are probably not very good chairs. You should be open to the idea that you might not have the perfect call, and you should make sure that you are listening to your panelists and are open to being persuaded that your call is not necessarily the correct one. So, in terms of panel management, the first thing we might want to discuss is just what our goals at the offset of managing a panel probably are. So, the first, kind of simply, is that you want to be done in 15 minutes, or whatever the amount of time you've been given by the chief adjudicators is to finish your deliberation. And that's not a lot of time. So that does demand from you a level of conciseness in the way that you do manage that deliberation, and a level of self-discipline that means that you don't let things drag on to 20 or 25 minutes when they could be dealt with in a shorter amount of time. It's not always easy, and there might be cases where you have a larger panel or a significant amount of disagreements where things might go to 20 minutes or so, but you should always be aiming to finish your deliberation in the 50 minutes that you have been allotted. The second thing that you should aim to do always is to make sure all of the panelists have an equal chance to participate in the deliberation, and that all of them have an equal chance to contribute their opinion and their read of the debate to the discussion that's ultimately taking place. Sometimes certain panelists might need a little bit more time and a little bit more encouragement than other panelists. So people tend to vary in confidence, and there might be people with a level of structural barrier or just less confidence in themselves that are less likely to participate if you don't give them that encouragement. So what that means then is if you do have different panelists who seem to be a bit quieter, you should make an effort to try and encourage them to speak and give them the opportunity to speak, even and especially if they're not as likely to jump at the opportunity to give a comparison or jump at the opportunity to contribute their opinion. I would say, obviously, this is not a conclusive list, and also I'm not saying that everyone in these categories is likely to need this extra time and encouragement, but often female panelists who are less experienced might lack confidence, and you might want to give them a bit more time to hear their opinion and make sure that they're able to express themselves well in your deliberation. Often speakers who are ESL or EFL and have not a lot of experience with English or not a lot of experience with giving reasoning of this kind in a language that is not their mother tongue, or who simply don't have the level of fluency that some more experienced speakers might have. You might want to make sure you give them enough time to make their point clearly and to make sure that they are heard. Anyone with a speech impediment who might have like a stutter or anything that stops them from expressing themselves as succinctly, you might want to make sure they have enough time. And generally people who just seem to be less confident in their call or less confident in their reasoning, you want to make sure you are giving them some ability to express themselves and you allow for the space for them to be heard in that discussion. Additionally, the flip side is also true. Sometimes you have extremely eager panelists, ones who want to jump over the other panelists to speak, who are always volunteering to give the discussion or to give the reasoning on a certain comparison. It is also your job to keep those people in check and keep those people to time. So you should be both encouraging people to participate, but also balancing that against the requirement that you have everyone getting a chance to participate and that you keep deliberation to 15 minutes. So in that respect, you want to make sure that you have kind of the various needs of various panelists in mind at any given time. The third thing that you should set out to do when you are managing a panel is to discuss these 6 pairwise comparisons in the appropriate amount of detail for that debate. So in British parliamentary debating, when we are coming to a ranking of which team has come first to which team has come fourth, we are not just making a decision based on the fact that we think a certain argument is good, and therefore that team should win the debate. It's always a comparative game relative to the other 3 teams that exist in the debate. You're never winning a debate because you had a good argument. You're winning a debate because you had a comparatively better argument than 3 other teams, and therefore you were able to beat those 3 teams, which allowed you to come first. There are 6 of those comparisons. So there is the top half discussion, there is the short diagonal discussion, the government bench, the long diagonal discussion, and the opposition bench, and the closing half. So that's 6 comparisons that need to be discussed and need to be considered and voted on when you are managing a panel. Ideally, you should be setting out to discuss all 6 of those in the amount of detail necessary to explain why they are correct. So in certain debates, that might be you maybe only need 30 seconds to a minute to explain why the team in first has beaten the team in fourth, but you should be aiming always to discuss all of those comparisons to make sure that the call you reach is well reasoned and that you understand why everyone has come to the call that they have. While I say you should try and do 6, often in 15 minutes, that is not always possible. And so I would say at minimum, you should be aiming to do 4 comparisons, even if everyone has the same call and everything is unanimous otherwise. That will at least mean you discuss every team once, because every team is involved in 3 comparisons and then the 3 comparisons don't involve them. So if you discuss 4 comparisons, you are necessarily going to discuss all 4 teams at some point, and that will give you at least a solid understanding of why each team is placed they have in the debate, you should always try to do all of them. But if you can't do more than four, you should at least be aiming to do four. And additionally, the way in which you discuss those comparisons should make sure that any and all questions from the round are answered. So if there is something about the government bench that is a bit close, you're not sure if an extension is derivative or if a piece of weighing was sufficient, or if you're talking about the short diagonal and you're not sure if closing government's responses to opening opposition were enough to take down their argument, or if there was in fact some kind of preemption in the opening opposition case the closing government had to deal with and didn't. You need to discuss those questions and answer those questions to make sure that everyone on the panel is clear, or at least the majority of the panel is clear, on how you view that question being answered and how you view the material in the debate and where it lands. And the fourth and final thing that you are aiming to do when you're managing a panel is to reach the correct and ideally, but not always, consensus call and decision. The correct decision isn't always going to be your decision. You might have questions, you might make mistakes, you might just be willing to be persuaded on a very close comparison from the offset and end up being persuaded on that comparison. So one of the reasons I do stress that you should be open to be persuaded is because you're aiming for the right call and the right call just might not be yours. And that's something to keep in mind. But the second thing to keep in mind is that while you should always try, if possible, to, give the reasoning that's going to convince everyone and find the reasoning that's going to lead to the most correct call that everyone can agree is the most correct call, that might not always be a possibility. Sometimes you just have panelists who have a very different read of the debate to you. Sometimes you might just be judging with people who are stubborn but bad. Sometimes it might just be very subjective and it's not clear how you should weigh in on a certain comparison. And where consensus is impossible, the onus still is on you to call a vote on those comparisons, even if that means that your call is not the one that's going through. So sometimes it might be the case that you are required to call a vote by time constraints and by the fact that the rest of the panel sees things very differently to you, and that they see things very differently to you in a way where you won't be able to change their minds in 15 minutes, and the reasoning to do so is not coming to you. You still need to call a vote, even if that means that you're being rolled. So obviously, you're always trying to weigh between and make sure you're considering multiple different priorities at any given time in managing a panel. But what that means then is that you're aiming to get the right call. Sometimes that's not possible, or sometimes it's not possible to convince everyone on the panel that it's the right call, and you have to call a vote anyway, even if it's not a consensus decision. But those are probably the four things that you're setting out to do anytime that you are managing a panel in deliberation. So pragmatically speaking, a very high-level overview of what deliberation looks like probably looks like this. The first thing you're going to do, very simply, is that you're going to start your timer as the teams are leaving the room. And the reason for that is because 15 minutes is not a long time, but it's also a very hard amount of time to kind of vibe out and make sure that you're sticking to. If you are trying to keep track of time and make sure that you are operating within the time constraints you're given, you need to be aware of how much time has already passed. So the first thing you need to do is you very obviously need to start your timer. The second thing you should do is give your panelists about 2 minutes. Some people would go for less, like a minute and a half. I tend to go for 2 minutes to reach initial calls. And you should tell them at the offset that that is what you're doing. So you should tell them at the moment you start your timer that they're going to have about 2 minutes to reach an initial call, that you don't need it to be their final call or a very, rigorously reasoned call, but the best that they can come up with in 2 minutes. I think this is especially important because a lot of the time, the panelists you might be working with at competitions may not be very experienced judges, and they may not be people who have a call at the end of the debate. So they will need that time to look over their notes and either answer certain questions or just come to a decision about which teams they think have done better in the debate and which teams have done worse. You should also just communicate the amount of time you're going to give them so that they're not like sitting in silence, confused as to what you want from them. You are ultimately managing a discussion of multiple people, so you should tell them what to expect at the beginning of that discussion. The third thing that you should do is, at the point where you take initial calls off the panelists, is you should write down what the initial calls of all the panelists, including yourself, actually were. And the reason for that is because that's going to tell you a lot about how you should end up structuring the deliberation, and it'll tell you a lot about what comparisons there is currently agreement on and what comparisons there is currently disagreement on. And sometimes it might also tell you about which teams and maybe an idea of why there is disagreement on. So for example, if everyone but one person has closing government in fourth, but that one person has them in first or second, that would suggest that there is something in the extension that either the person in the minority is seeing that other people are not, or there is some flaw in the extension that the majority of the panel are seeing, but this other person is not. And so that tells you there's at least a difference of opinion that needs to be resolved in order to answer certain questions and to answer certain comparisons. That means you need to have an idea throughout the deliberation of what everyone's initial close starting points actually were. The fourth thing you should do is begin discussing the pairwise comparisons. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a second. But this is where you want to start talking about those 6 comparisons in the debate, resolve those questions, and try to come to a majority decision on each of those 6 ones in a way that leads to a majority call at the end of the debate, right, first to fourth. The next thing you'll do at the end of your 15 minutes is you will award speaker points. I would say best practice to do this is always just to pull out the speaker scale for the tournament you're at. This is normally going to be the Korea Worlds one or the Copenhagen Euros one, which is the same, but just has some questions at the top that you might wish to refer to. But you want to pull that out. You want to address the bracket of the speaker scale that you think is appropriate for each team, and discuss with your panelists, firstly, who in each team they think gets the better speaks, if anyone was a better speaker than the other, or if people should get the same speaker points. Secondly, you might want to read out a bracket to them without giving the numbers, and ask if they think that's the appropriate bracket for those speakers. And the reason to do so without giving the numbers is that sometimes people get in their head certain ideas about an 80 has to be this, or a 75 is the average speak at Worlds. And those things aren't really accurate heuristics for how you should award speaks. A better way to do it is to sort of just blind test, ask people if the description that you've read out is the accurate description for that team. And if they agree, then that's the bracket that you should be pulling from, even if it is a higher number or a lower number than people feel is appropriate for that speaker. The next thing you want to do is to submit your ballot. It's also on you to make sure that all of the ballots are consistent. And often panelists might make certain mistakes in like ticking which speaker is an iron speaker, or in entering the speaks into the ballot, or they might get the speaking order wrong, things like that. So it is on you, and you should devote a bit of time to making sure that all of the ballots that are submitted are the same, and have everything in the same way. Otherwise, you're quite likely to get interrupted in the OA by the tab director or something like this, and it's quite likely to cause you a bit of a hassle. You should just try your best to make sure everything submitted is the same. And the final thing you'll do is invite the teams back in for the oral adjudication. One of the sort of downsides of being the chair is that you don't get much time to breathe between the debate and then the delib and then the oral adjudication. It's quite an intense sort of hour, 40 minutes for the chair judge. But pretty much immediately what you're going to do is bring the teams back in to discuss the debate that's happened and to outline the deliberation and the call that you ultimately reached. So when it comes to managing the discussion, there are 4 things to keep in mind, I think, when actually managing a discussion and when actually getting everyone to express their opinion and to try and reach a decision with the panelists that you have. The first thing you should do is that you should always discuss along pairwise comparisons. Even if someone's mind is changed on one pairwise comparison, it doesn't mean they're changed in others. So you always need to make sure you're considering all of those pairwise comparisons when coming to these points. So, for example, if you have a particular round where everyone has closing opposition in first, except for one judge who has them in fourth, you might convince them that the team they initially had in first actually lost to closing opposition. But that doesn't mean that that judge has accepted that closing opposition has beaten the other 2 teams. So you need to make sure that in order to convince that panelist the closing opposition came first and not fourth, that you discuss the 3 pairwise comparisons the closing opposition is involved in to explain to them and persuade that panelist that closing opposition has beaten all 3 of those other teams. You've always got to discuss them in this fashion, because the fact that you disagree and you could persuade someone out of one disagreement doesn't mean that they are agreeing with you on the other ones without actually having a discussion on those things. I would also say, even if everyone does unanimously agree on the entire call or on a specific particular comparison, it's still very important that you do discuss those comparisons in the deliberation, broadly for 3 reasons. The first is that even if the call on a certain comparison is the same, the reasoning that people have for coming to that call might be different, again, because judging is subjective to some degree. And you should make sure to reflect those differences of opinion in the OA. You might think that a case is kind of flawless and perfect, and so that team going first is natural. Your panelists might have more criticisms of the case, but those criticisms could help that team to improve and to fix some issue that other judges will also identify in the future. Or it could be that you might just initially miss something that otherwise should be explained. Equally, you might underweight a case or underweight the importance of something and be persuaded by your panelists that it's more important and should be brought up in the OA. But ultimately, your job in DLib is not just to manage the discussion, it's also to start building the oral adjudication that you're going to give. And since that is true, you want to make sure that you are getting the reasoning that the panelists actually used to come to the decision, even if everyone has come to the same decision and it's not strictly necessary to persuade people. It's still important that you reflect it in the OA at the end of the day. The second thing, or second reason, that you should still discuss unanimous comparisons is that it just means you're going to give more accurate judge feedback on the panelists who are with you. Like I said at the start of this, the CAP have ultimately trusted you with the position of chair, and with that position came certain responsibilities. You are the only person who could report back to the CAs about what happened at the deliberation, and at a big comp, like any major, but also any comp over 15 rooms, it's very unlikely the CA team are going to see most judges, and the way they adjudicate the judge break or determine which judges might judge which out rounds is largely dependent on feedback and the information that comes from that feedback. You then have some obligation to gather as much information as you can so the feedback you provide in those panelists is fair and accurate, and the CA team can make the most meritocratic decisions about the judge break and about that person's potential to break. So there is like a pretty big difference between submitting like a 4 with no routing or a 5 where you explain why you think this person is maybe could chair a later round but shouldn't maybe chair anything earlier and might break but maybe shouldn't break if other people have the possibility to do so. But you should make sure you have enough information to give fair feedback on those people, and having them provide the justifications on comparisons, even if you agree on those comparisons, is the main way that you're going to do that. And the third reason you should still discuss comparisons, even if they are unanimous, is that it just is good to give panelists the practice of developing and providing reasons for why one team beats another in a pairwise comparison. Most panelists who stick around the activity for long enough are eventually going to start chairing. And when they do, they will be expected pretty much immediately to give oral adjudications. All an OA is doing the thing you would do in DLib as a panelist, which is giving reasons why one team beats another, but in a more specific and structured way to explain an entire debate, not just one pairwise comparison. So it's good then to let your panelists practice giving their reasoning on certain comparisons so they can hone that skill for the future. It's I think, essentially important for development in that respect. But for those reasons, you should always discuss long pairwise comparisons, even if people agree on everything. And you should always discuss long pairwise comparisons because it is the fairest way to make sure you actually convince people to the same call and that you actually explain why each team is placed where they have in the debate. The second thing you should do in managing the discussion, and the way you should structure a deliberation, is to start at the point of disagreement. So that is to say, if everyone agrees that sort of opening government beats opening opposition, but people disagree as to whether closing opposition beats opening opposition, that is a point that you should probably start with over the top half. You should start at the point where people disagree and where they have a difference of opinion and assessment of a case. That's going to get you to a better position, even if you can't convince people, just in understanding where people are at in the debate and what they're seeing in the debate that's taking place. The third thing I would say is that you should ask your panelists very specific questions. You should ask them to describe why one team beats another in the comparison, but you should ask them specific questions about what you think is important to make sure that the things that are weighing in your mind on the comparison are being considered and are being given a fair bit of attention. So for example, you might ask your panelist not just tell me what opening opposition does in the debate or tell me why opening opposition comes first. That would be quite an unspecific question. You might ask them, why does opening opposition defeat closing opposition? Or you might take a response one team gives to another and say, what did you think of this response? What did you think of this weighing? Or do you think this point is proven? Why not? Or how do they prove it? Where is the analysis for doing so? Or if you and a panelist disagree as to whether or not a team's case is derivative, you might ask, what do you think is the new contribution of that team over what is already present in their opening? But you should ask them specific questions to make sure people get onto the same page and so you can understand why people have come to the decisions they have and whether they have taken into account very specific things that you might think are important. The second thing I would say is you should try not to weigh in or to give your assessment of a comparison until everybody else has spoken. So that might mean that you have two panelists. You ask one of them to do the closing half comparison to explain why closing government should be closing opposition. You ask the other to explain why closing opposition beats closing government. And at the end of that, you might then weigh in and explain why you used to think that closing opposition won, but now you think closing government wins at the discussion. Or it might be that you think closing government wins for the same reasons as the panelists who defended closing government, and maybe also for an additional one. And then you might call a vote. But you should try to make sure everyone else has the chance to participate and to engage on the discussion so that you have a very clear idea of the page everybody is on, and then weigh in to try and determine and resolve that clash at the end of that. When all else fails, or if enough time has taken place that it is necessary to do so, you should just call a vote on comparisons, even if you cannot convince people. But you should do so having tried to discuss and given time to discussing all of the comparisons that are relevant in that debate. It might just be that you cannot convince people, and at that point you should call a vote. To be slightly more specific, we'll go through a few scenarios that you might face as a chair, and how you might end up trying to resolve those things or to put into practice the things I've just said about managing the discussion in order to reach a decision that is, a fair representation of the debate that's taken place. So the first scenario you might face is one where everyone agrees on what the call should be from the start. This is kind of a position people like to be in. I understand why. Because at this point, you don't necessarily have to convince your panelists of anything. You don't have to convince them to do anything or think anything that they don't already think. But as I've said earlier, you should still make sure to do all or most of the comparisons to make sure that all the teams really are discussed, that you're very clear on the reasoning everyone does have, that you're able to provide better feedback both to the teams, what the panelists thought of their cases, but also to the CAs about the panelists and the way they performed in the deliberation, and to make sure the OA you give is as fair a reflection of the deliberation that took place as possible, but also as fair a reflection of the ways that a team could improve as possible. Out of that, in that respect, and out of fairness, you should still make sure to do all of the comparisons, even though everyone agrees already. The second scenario that you might face is one where everyone almost agrees, but maybe their assessment of one team or one or two comparisons differs a little bit. So in this case, very similarly to the previous one, the chair and one of the panelists think opening opposition wins, opening government takes the second, closing government takes the third, and closing opposition takes the fourth. Except that the second panelist agrees on most of these comparisons. They agree sort of that OO beats CO, and that OG beats CO, and that CG beats CO, and that OO wins the top half. Where they disagree is they think that closing government takes the first, and that the two top half teams are in fact coming below closing government rather than above closing government. That might be a slightly more confusing situation in that if you and the panelists are very sure that the call is one thing and this other person has a very different read of one of the teams, that can sometimes be a slightly odd one. But what you should make sure to do in that situation is still to start at the point of disagreement and to start your discussion with an understanding of where it is you disagree and why. In this case, the second panelist has quite a different read of closing government. And what that might tell you is that maybe the other two think that opening government has beaten closing government because CG is derivative, or maybe that CG's case is contingent on OG or something like this, but that the other panelist doesn't think so. So you likely want to start with either positioning CG against OG or positioning CG against OO. It might depend on the debate that's taking place. Given I would say that more of the time, people's belief or people's disagreement over how a back half team is done has to do with their relationship with their openings, so derivativeness or, lack of weighing or things like contingency. It might be a better idea to start with the gov bench, but ultimately you should start with comparing closing government to one of the top half teams where you disagree on the comparison and determining where it is you disagree and what CG brings to the debate, and trying to resolve that discussion, trying to resolve the opinion of what CG has actually brought into that debate. You will then want to do the CG against the other top half team to make sure that you are in agreement, or at least that you've been able to have a discussion and call a majority vote on both of those comparisons. And after that point, you should then try and do the comparisons where you do agree. So make sure you still are very clear on why OO wins the top half, very clear on why the other three teams all beat closing opposition. Make sure those teams are still discussed the debate, even if it's a bit less urgent. The third thing you might face is a case where there's some agreements, but there's also some differences in people's opinions. So for example, in this, all teams agree that opening government has come fourth. All teams agree that opening opposition has beaten opening government. All teams agree that closing government has beaten opening government. There is, however, disagreement as to who wins the back half, who wins the op bench, and who wins the short diagonal. So that's maybe, again, slightly more stressful as a situation. It's one where there's more disagreement than there is agreement. But what you should start with is where it is that people disagree the most and work from there. So, where people seem to disagree the most in this case probably has to do with closing opposition. So, whether or not they have a legitimate extension over opening opposition, and then whether or not they compare against closing government in a way that means that they should win the debate or not win the debate. Positioning closing opposition against then opening opposition to start with would help to explain and understand where people disagree and why people disagree. And then you would be able to resolve them against closing government, and then maybe resolve the short diagonal to understand why people disagree as to sort of where OO places against the back half teams and where the back half teams place against each other. But you will want to start with where you're having the most level of disagreement, because it is the case that the fact that everyone's placed CO so differently indicates that people have quite a different assessment of the CO case, and therefore you should try and resolve that assessment in the process of doing those pairwise comparisons in order to try and come to a decision that makes the most sense. That doesn't mean that you should all just accept that OG is fourth and not discuss them at all, but it does mean that you should start with where you have the most disagreement, and you can work your way from there to the places where you do agree, and to dealing with the comparisons that put OG in fourth near the end. The final situation you might face is just kind of sheer chaos where there is no agreement on anything or on almost anything. So if you take these three calls, no one agrees on who wins the top half, no one agrees on who wins the government bench, no one agrees on who wins the short diagonal, the op bench, or the back half, or the long diagonal. So there is not one comparison that these three people all agree on is the same. That kind of is maybe where people tend to panic the most, especially when they're new chairs. They can get roles. There's enough judges who could conceivably roll them. And there's just kind of total mayhem about which teams are doing well in the debate and which teams are not. But the first thing I would say is that you should just try not to panic in that situation. The fact is that, there are 24 possible calls in any given debate. There's 24 different ways that you can rank the four teams in a debate. And so there are just going to be times where a debate has been so messy, or it's been so weird, or it's been so subjective that people will come to different decisions and they will pick quite different versions of the call from those 24 possible calls. But what you should do is to just start somewhere, start your discussion somewhere, and have a discussion from there that tries to get to a majority decision and tries to cover all six comparisons in a way that leads you to a call that makes sense. So one of those might be if you're very confident in your call and you're pretty sure your call is correct, maybe you could start explaining why you think that the team you have in third is beating the team you have in fourth, so why you think OO beats OG. Then you might want to talk about why you think one team has come second and one's come third, so you might explain why you think CO wins the opposition bench. And then you might try and explain why you think that on the back half, CG beats CO. And then from there, the remaining comparisons that are left unresolved, you might address to make sure you can get to a majority call. But if you are really sure that you could persuade your panelists of these things, going from fourth to first might be a call that makes sense for you. Something else that might make sense is just to start with the top half in any debate to try and get a foundation for the rest of your discussion that just kind of explains what the two top half teams brought to the debate so that you're all on the same page going forward. And then you can bring the back half teams in after you resolve that comparison. Or it might just be if you think that closing government's case, which in this case, the chair has, kind of a minority opinion on whether or not that case is good, you might have a pretty strong view that that case was very good and won the debate. You might want to have a discussion that starts with trying to understand what CG brought to the debate, and then explain why that beats their opening, why it beats opening opposition, and why it beats closing opposition. And then bring in the other teams as relevant to explain what they brought to the debate and why it caused it to place where they do. Out-round deliberations might be a little bit different to the average in-round, broadly for three reasons. So there's probably a fourth, which I haven't actually written on the slide, and the fourth is often the panels are just bigger. Often out-rounds will have 5-person panels, maybe 7-person panels. For very big competitions, maybe the grand final will have 9-person panels. So sometimes it is just the case that you're managing a far bigger panel. That's something you might want to bear in mind. And additionally, and on top of that, you might be given more time to reflect the fact that you have a much bigger panel. But the 3 things I have on the slide, in addition to that, would firstly be that you don't have an oral adjudication for an out round, or sometimes you do in World Schools, but in BP, you're not going to have an OA for out rounds themselves. The second is that you don't need a full call, and you shouldn't be trying to chair towards a full call. You don't need unanimous decisions on 6 comparisons at this point. You need to determine the 2 teams that the majority believes should advance through that out round. So the deliberation is guided towards finding the teams that have come first and second, but the order is not important. It doesn't matter which team has come first or second and which team has come third or fourth. It just matters that you have a majority decision on which 2 teams have placed as the top 2 and which 2 teams have placed as the bottom 2 in the debate that has taken place. What that means, though, and I really would stress this because in some recent out rounds that I've been on panels for, this hasn't always been the case. You have to discuss and call a vote on at least 4 discrete comparisons. And the reason for that is to determine that a team has come at least second in the debate, you need to show that they have beaten the 2 teams who have not gone through. So let's say that in a given debate, the decision ultimately reached, or the decision the chair believes is the case and is trying to chair towards, is that the top half teams have gone through and the back half teams have not gone through. Even if everyone agrees that the 2 top half teams are the first and second and should go through, and the 2 back half teams are the third and fourth and shouldn't go through, you still need to discuss, firstly, why opening opposition beats closing government, and secondly, why opening opposition beats closing opposition. You don't need to do the top half because it doesn't matter who has come first necessarily over second, and you don't need to do the back half because it doesn't matter who's come third or fourth. But it does matter that you explain that opening opposition has beaten both of the back half teams because that is what allows them to take at least the second and advance over those teams into the next round. Similarly, you need to do the same with opening government to explain why they win the 2 comparisons against the 2 teams who also don't go through. So that means you need to do the government bench and you need to do the long diagonal. Once you have done those 4 comparisons and reached a majority decision on those 4 comparisons, you have done your job as an out round chair. And so you have put through 2 teams to the next round. It is not necessary, although sometimes people choose to resolve which team comes first. And it's not necessary at all to resolve which team has come fourth. But it is important that you justify and that everyone on the panel is able to say the reasoning of and to fully back and sort of say with their chest why those 2 teams advance over the 2 teams who do not advance. That requires you to do at least 4 discrete pairwise comparisons. So one example that you might face of just sort of the kind of split that might take place is, this is also taken from a recent out round I was judging. You might have a case where the chair believes that closing government wins, opening government takes the second, opening opposition takes the third, and closing opposition takes the fourth. And then they have 2 panelists. One of them agrees that CG wins, disagrees on who takes the second and third in the top half, but agrees that closing opposition takes the fourth. The other has kind of a different read, so agrees with panelist 1 that opening opposition beats opening government on the top half, but disagrees entirely with the read that closing government wins the debate. They think closing government has taken the fourth rather than the first. So, as the chair of this debate, who genuinely might believe that closing government definitely goes through, you might start with a discussion of the short diagonal to try and understand why panelist 2 has closing government losing so definitively to opening opposition. At the end of this discussion, panelist 2 might be convinced that closing government beats opening opposition. But as sort of said earlier in this workshop, that doesn't mean that you've also convinced panelist 2 that closing government has won. Just because you've convinced them that they've beaten the team that panelist 2 initially had winning, that doesn't mean you've convinced them at all that CG's won either the gov bench or the back half. So in order to convince panelist 2 that that is definitely a team that is going through, you need to, at the very least, kick out closing opposition. So you need to explain why CG beats CO. And then, depending on which team ultimately ends up winning the top half, you also need to explain why they've beaten the team who doesn't advance. So in this case, maybe it's ultimately OO who ends up going through. You would need to explain then to panelist 2 or convince panelist 2 that CG has beaten both OG and CO in order to go through with opening opposition. Or you might just, for thoroughness, do both of those comparisons before moving on to the top half. So make sure that you explain and reach a decision that CG has beaten both opening government and closing opposition. So at this point that they have come first. And then spend some more time on the top half, which is the closer comparison, to determine who the second team going through is. But my point in sort of pointing at an example here is that there are times when there are disagreements on outrounds, and that those disagreements need to lead you to a decision as to how to manage that panel and which comparisons to do. It is important still that you firstly do all of the relevant comparisons so that even if you convince someone the team that they have in fourth has actually beaten the team they have in first, you still need to do the other relevant comparisons to agree that that team has won. But secondly, you need to make sure that you explain why that team has beaten the two teams who have not advanced. Even if the other person accepts they beat the other advancing team, you need everyone to be on the same page that that team has beaten the two teams who are not going through in order for that team to actually be going through. The final thing to say sort of on this managing a panel section is just about grand finals. The difference between grand finals and an out round generally, and grand finals and any in round, are that grand finals are not a round where it actually matters who takes second, third, or fourth. For the purposes of a grand final, you basically can only take a first or a fourth. Like you're only winning or you are not winning. What that means then is that as a chair, deliberation needs to be guided towards finding a winner. The second, third, and fourth don't matter. But the number of comparisons that you need at minimum to discuss in a grand final are then 3. Even if everybody accepts at the off that opening opposition has won a given debate, you need to explain why opening opposition has beaten opening government, has beaten closing government, and has beaten closing opposition. Because it's only when you have discussed and have a well-reasoned understanding of why that team has beaten each of those 3 teams, then you are able to say that team has won the debate. So even if everyone agrees fully which team wins, you need to make sure you do those 3 comparisons in order to have fairly considered the other 3 teams against them. And it doesn't matter if people actually have very different reads on who took the second or third or fourth. You don't need to resolve those questions at all in a grand final. You just need to make sure that you have explained in detail why that team beats the other 3 teams. There might be sometimes cases where there is agreement on certain things. You still need to make sure that the way in which you decide to do any given deliberation reflects the debate that's taken place and reflects the spread of initial calls that exist in that. So, for example, on this one, everyone agrees that opening government has taken the fourth. One person thinks that opening opposition has won the debate, but agrees with the chair that CG beats CO. The chair thinks it's a back half with CG beating CO. And the other panelist thinks it's a back half, but thinks that CO beats CG. So the way that you might want to go around constructing this discussion, this being a slightly more complicated one where there is not a unanimous decision on who is winning from the off, is likely that you want to at least explain in a way that is fair to that team, so when they ask for feedback later, you can explain the decision, why opening government loses to the other teams. So why opening government loses to closing government, why they lose to closing opposition, and why they lose to opening opposition. If they unanimously fourth, it might not be too difficult to do this. It may not take too much time. You should still make sure that that team is, adequately given their chance and the reasoning is fair to that team. But you should make sure to kick them out of the discussion first, rather than at the end sort of throw in 10 seconds about why that team didn't do very well. That's not fair to that team or the argument they have run. The second thing you might want to do as a chair, at this point believing that it was a back half discussion, is to bring in opening opposition against the back half teams to try and understand why panelist 2 thinks that opening opposition beats both of the back half teams. So that might be starting them on the short diagonal to try and explain why they've beaten the team that the chair thinks comes in first. And once that discussion is resolved, so either in finding and convincing the other 2 that in fact opening opposition has won against CG, or in convincing panelists 2 that that team has lost to CG, you also want to explain why opening opposition wins or loses against closing opposition and resolve that question as well. And finally, if you're able to convince panelists 2 either that opening opposition also loses to CO, or just reach a majority decision and call a vote on that comparison, at that point you will want to have the discussion of the back half and resolve which team should win the back half. And you might notice then that doesn't, we've ended up doing a lot of the comparisons in this particular debate because that was what was necessary to give a fair consideration to all those teams and to convince the panelist who is largely in the minority to the majority call. But that is what in this debate you might choose as a strategy to understand why and to decide how you're going to discuss those teams and how you're going to manage that particular deliberation. That is, I think, one of the just a way of walking through a scenario to explain how you might go about doing something, given there's a pretty vast array of different calls. So that's it for the section on managing the deliberation itself. Next, we're going to talk about oral adjudications. We'll probably wrap up relatively shortly after 8, and we can take questions at that point. So when we talk about oral adjudications, there are a couple of goals we have as to what we want to achieve at the end of the OA. The first is similar to deliberation. We'd like to be done in 15 minutes. The second is that we're aiming to explain how the decision was reached. In an ideal world, we'd be aiming to convince the teams that the correct decision was reached, but that's not always going to be possible, even if you give the perfect OA. It is sort of true that most debaters think they've won any debate they've ever been in. It's also true that debaters can be salty and sort of believe their own hype a little bit more than is maybe proportionate. It also can sometimes just be true that there was a very reppy team in the debate, or a very like stylistically pleasing team in the debate, or that it was just one of those debates where what all of the teams thought was going on was kind of different to what the panel thought was going on. So for those reasons that you might have the perfect OA, and you still might not convince the teams that the decision reached was the objectively correct one, you should, however, still be aiming to do so, and you should be aiming to give a fair explanation of how the decision was reached that is an accurate representation of what happened in deliberation. And the third thing that you should be aiming to do in an oral adjudication is to teach the teams what they did right and what they did wrong. When we debate and we are listening to an OA, we are ultimately looking for feedback, and we are ultimately trying to learn and to understand what we can iteratively improve upon in the next debate and the next debate, and maybe ultimately in the major down the line that we might be preparing for. So you are aiming to teach teams what they have actually achieved and done well, and you're also trying to teach them what they can improve upon. And that's something that you should bear in mind when you are doing an OA. So what makes a good OA? I think there are broadly 4 things that you might want to consider and have in mind when trying to give it sort of a good OA. The first is that a good OA should be precise. That means the reasoning should be clear, the lessons for teams to take away should be clear, and specifics are also going to help instill confidence in them that you did reach the right decision, or at least that you reached the decision that you did fairly. Secondly, a good OA is short and sweet. So that means you want your OA to be concise. That's going to look like picking the most important reasons for comparison rather than giving every reason under the sun as to why, a derivative team has lost to their opening. It also means choosing your words carefully in a way that is clear and is explaining what you mean, is the most efficient way to do it. And generally, it's about being efficient in the way you deliver and structure the OA, meaning that you are giving sort of the most efficient explanation for the call that was reached that is also representative of that call. The third is that a good OA should be honest. And I think this is maybe one of the areas where speakers can get the most frustrated when they are told in an OA that it's a particularly close debate. And then at the end of the competition, they check the ballot and it's actually like a 10-speak gap or something that just clearly doesn't reflect anything like as close as the chair that actually expressed in the OA. So what you should never do is to mislead or patronize teams, or try and say that a debate was closer than it was, or pretend a team won by a landslide when they actually didn't. It's often extremely clear when a judge isn't being honest, but it also hinders your ability to meet the goals of what an OA is trying to do. Dishonesty is going to stop you from actually explaining how you did reach the decision you reached, and it's going to prevent teams from learning the key lessons about what did work and what didn't work in this debate. So obviously you should still be kind, and you should still be, supportive. You shouldn't just kind of like be cruel to teams that haven't done well. But if it is true that one team lost to another by a pretty large margin, you should say that they lost by a pretty large margin, and then you should explain why that is the case. If one team lost because they were very derivative, they didn't have a new extension at all, you should say that they were extremely derivative and explain why that meant they lost the debate. Don't pretend a debate was close if it wasn't, and don't pretend that a team really won super clearly when they actually didn't. You should always just be striving to be honest in these situations. And the final thing I would say is that a good OA should ultimately be encouraging. Sometimes when you're starting out as a chair in particular, you're going to judge rooms that you don't think are particularly good, but you should always be making sure to still treat the teams in that room with respect. It might be that you think it was a really bad debate. It was an econ debate and everyone said things that just didn't make any sense at all, and none of them were at all clear on their arguments, or it was really messy. And maybe you'll think it was a debate that if you'd been speaking in, you could have won it in an instant. But you still should remember that everyone has to start somewhere. Everybody has off rounds, and we're all ultimately here to learn, and we're here to have fun in an activity we do in our spare time. So a really cruel and dismissive OA can often be the reason a person stops debating, and a clear and encouraging one can be the reason that they keep it up. So I would just stress to always be encouraging and always try to point out what a team has done well in the debate as well as what they've done wrong. And never allow a bad performance, a clear fourth, a 2-minute speech given to stop you from treating a team with respect, to stop treating them as a team. You should just basically never let that allow you to treat a team like they don't deserve to be there. You should always be encouraging. You should always be trying to point out what people did right and always trying to convince them that the next speech will be better than the last. Pragmatically speaking, when you are structuring the OA, you've got to make sure that you explain all 6 pairwise comparisons in the oral adjudication. So a fairly common structure overall that I think works decently well is to start off with some general feedback, though my caveat would be you should do so if you genuinely have general feedback. If you genuinely think that every team in the debate made a similar mistake, you should start with general feedback. The cases where I think that can happen more are where a debate is either very messy, where people get hung up on the wrong thing, where the whole debate misreads the motion, or where just people are very unclear on the comparative or very unclear on the counterfactual in a motion that really demands it of people. Those are areas where a common mistake might affect all teams and may or may not affect the call, but certainly is a mistake that all teams have made that you might want to point out. After that, you probably want to give the call. And the reason I'd say after is because for many teams, they might not listen to a single word you say after they find out if they've won or not. So giving the feedback before at least means they're more likely to take it on. And then the final thing is just when structuring the actual discussion of how you reach the call that you did. Broadly, there are 2 common approaches for OAs and BP, both of which I think work pretty well. The first is a chronological discussion, so that you start off with the top half, you explain what opening government said, then what opening opposition said, and you explain why the team who won the top half did indeed win the top half. Then you'll bring in closing government, explain what they brought to the debate, compare them to their opening, explain who wins the gov bench, and then explain who wins the short diagonal. And then finally bring in closing opposition and explain what they bring to the debate, how they weigh against opening opposition, opening government, and closing government. That could be a pretty good approach because it means that you are sort of iteratively bringing in teams and explaining what each of those teams has brought to the debate, what they have contributed. But also you are covering all 6 comparisons in the OA at that point. The second thing, which is the version I'm less likely to go for in my own OAs, but I know people who do, and it tends to work quite well, is to go fourth to first. So the first comparison you're going to do is explaining why the team who comes in third has beaten the team who comes in fourth. Then you'll bring in the team who comes in second and explain why they beat both the team who comes in third and the team who comes in fourth. And finally, you'll bring in the team who wins the debate, explain why they beat the team in second, why they beat the team in third, and why they beat the team in fourth. That's also a pretty good way to make sure that you cover all 6 pairwise comparisons. And where it might be useful is in cases where maybe the call is somewhat clearer, or maybe the reason that a team beats other teams has to do with the strength of that team's own material and the weakness of the teams who did a bit less well. So sometimes it is the case when people are following this sort of chronological approach and maybe CO loses because they're derivative. The chair might, without meaning to, sort of rush the last 3 comparisons, kind of rush that CO is derivative, and therefore they lose to their opening, they lose to OG, and they lose to CG. And that's not going to give you a lot of detail on those comparisons or detail as to what's done well. You are certainly going to make sure detail is given to the team who comes fourth and third, if that's the comparison you start off with, and you're very clear what those teams bring at the off. But you're also going to have a pretty clear discussion on how they are now interacting with each of the teams when you have the team in fourth, even if they're in closing opposition or at the end of the debate, kind of coming through the oral adjudication throughout. So in cases where you might want the teams who've done less well to get a very considered, consideration in the OA, that might be an approach that you find better is the fourth to first approach. But both of those I think work pretty well. The main thing I would keep in mind is somewhat like with whip speeches, you should have a structure that you are following for most of your OAs. And you should be pretty clear at the point where you're starting the oral adjudication what structure you're going to follow. People vary as to whether or not they want to write out their OAs. I don't write out mine. I know people who do. But what you definitely should do is know the structure of what you're going to say for the next 15 minutes, even if you don't know every specific word of what you're going to say. So I would say do have an approach that you generally use, and do know at the start of the OA which of those approaches you're going to follow and what broadly the structure of your OA is going to look like. That's all for me in terms of chairing 101. I hope this is helpful. I'll just stop the recording so that if anyone has any questions, they're not sort of recorded on the internet forever. But thank you for your time, and good luck.